It's 3 a.m. in rural Pennsylvania. FBI agents are working by lamplight, digging frantically in a remote forest clearing. No media present. No official announcement. Just government officials secretly excavating what treasure hunters claim is the largest Civil War gold cache ever discovered. When confronted later, the FBI claims they found nothing, just some old metal scraps. But the treasure hunters have photos showing government trucks hauling away heavy containers in the dead of night. The same treasure hunters who spent decades researching, who had historical documents, who had ground-penetrating radar showing massive metal signatures in the exact spot the FBI chose to dig. Coincidence? I don't think so. What you're about to hear isn't just another treasure hunting story. This is about 52 tons of Confederate gold that vanished in 1865, donated by churches and Christian families who believed they were funding God's work. It's about secret societies, federal cover-ups, and a modern-day heist that makes Ocean's 11 look like child's play. The government doesn't want you to know this story because it exposes something much darker: how they've been rewriting history, seizing private property, and covering up evidence that challenges their narrative about America's past. I'm your host, and today we're exposing the truth about the lost Confederate gold. Hit that subscribe button because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the deep state is terrified of treasure hunters with shovels. Let's dig in. To understand what's happening today, we need to go back to April 1865. The Confederate States of America was collapsing. Richmond had fallen, and Jefferson Davis and his cabinet were fleeing south with what remained of the Confederate treasury. According to historical records, the Confederate government possessed millions of dollars in gold and silver coins, money that represented not just wealth, but the hopes and dreams of the Southern cause. This wasn't just any treasure. Much of this gold had been donated by churches, families, and communities across the South who believed they were funding a righteous cause. Here's where the Christian heritage component becomes crucial. Many of the people who contributed to this treasury were devout Christians who saw their struggle as divinely ordained. Churches across the South had melted down their silver communion sets, donated their gold crosses, and given sacrificially to support what they believed was their biblical right to self-determination. The Knights of the Golden Circle, a secretive organization that many historians now believe was instrumental in hiding Confederate treasure, was deeply intertwined with Christian symbolism and Masonic traditions. Their members included prominent Christians, pastors, and community leaders who viewed their mission as preserving not just wealth, but a way of life rooted in traditional Christian values. But here's what the history books don't tell you. As Union forces closed in, multiple wagon trains of gold mysteriously vanished. Captain William H. Parker, who was tasked with protecting the treasury, later claimed that much of the gold simply disappeared during their retreat. Some historians estimate that anywhere from 10 to 52 tons of gold and silver went missing, worth potentially hundreds of millions in today's dollars. The official story? It was all spent on supplies, lost to bandits, or simply never existed in the quantities claimed. But if that's true, why are treasure hunters still finding massive metal signatures buried across the South and Mid-Atlantic states? And more importantly, why is the federal government so interested in digging up these non-existent treasures? Now here's where this story gets really interesting from a Christian heritage perspective. The Confederate gold wasn't just government money. It was sacred treasure in the eyes of those who contributed it. Churches across the South viewed their financial support of the Confederacy as a holy mission. They believed they were preserving a Christian civilization against what they saw as Northern aggression that threatened their traditional way of life. Congregation members would bring their family heirlooms, wedding rings, even children's christening gifts to be melted down and added to the war chest. The Baptist churches of Georgia alone contributed over 200 pounds of gold. Methodist congregations in Virginia donated their church bells to be melted into coins. Presbyterian communities in the Carolinas gave up their communion silver. This wasn't just patriotism. This was religious devotion expressed through material sacrifice. But here's the kicker: much of this gold was never officially recorded. Church donations were often made quietly, without government receipts or documentation. This means there could be massive amounts of treasure that the federal government has no legal claim to whatsoever. When these churches donated their sacred items, they weren't giving them to the United States government. They were giving them to what they considered their legitimate government, the Confederate States. From a legal standpoint, this creates a massive problem for federal authorities today. The Knights of the Golden Circle weren't just treasure hunters. They were guardians of what they considered a sacred trust. Their rituals, their oaths, their entire organizational structure was built around Christian symbolism and the belief that they were preserving God's work for future generations. This religious component is why the federal government is so desperate to control the narrative. If significant amounts of Confederate gold are discovered, it raises uncomfortable questions about the legitimacy of federal claims to this treasure. It also validates the historical narrative that the South was fighting for more than just slavery. They were fighting to preserve their Christian heritage and way of life. Now let's fast forward to the political implications. The search for Confederate gold has become a proxy war for much larger cultural and political battles happening in America today. On one side, you have treasure hunters, historians, and patriots who believe that finding this gold would vindicate Southern heritage and challenge the federal government's monopoly on Civil War history. They argue that discovering substantial Confederate treasure would prove that the South was more organized, more legitimate, and more successful than mainstream historians want to admit. On the other side, you have federal authorities who seem determined to either debunk these treasure claims entirely or, when they can't debunk them, to seize control of any discoveries themselves. Why? Because Confederate gold represents something they can't tolerate: proof that their enemies were resourceful, organized, and successful at preserving wealth and heritage for future generations. This isn't just about money. It's about historical legitimacy. If Confederate leaders successfully hid millions of dollars in gold for over 160 years, it suggests a level of competence and foresight that doesn't fit the narrative of the bumbling, defeated rebels that we see in most history textbooks. The political establishment has spent decades portraying the Confederacy as an illegitimate, incompetent rebellion motivated solely by racism. But treasure caches suggest something different: a sophisticated operation that successfully preserved resources and maintained networks that continue to this day. Think about the implications. If the Knights of the Golden Circle successfully hid massive amounts of treasure using networks that span multiple states and have remained secret for over a century, what does that say about their organizational capabilities? What does it say about their continued influence? These are the questions that keep Washington bureaucrats awake at night. Because if traditional Southern heritage groups have been right about the treasure, what else have they been right about? Now let's talk about what's been happening recently, because this is where the story gets absolutely explosive. In 2018, treasure hunters Dennis and Kem Parada claimed they had located a massive cache of Civil War gold in Pennsylvania's Dense Run area. Using sophisticated ground-penetrating radar, they detected what appeared to be a large metallic mass buried in the exact location where historical documents suggested Confederate gold might have been hidden. The Paradas spent years researching this site. They had historical documents. They had eyewitness accounts passed down through families. They had scientific evidence from multiple types of metal detection equipment. Everything pointed to this being a legitimate treasure site. So what happened when they contacted authorities to follow proper legal procedures? The FBI swooped in, seized control of the site, and conducted their own excavation. But here's where it gets suspicious. They did their digging at night with minimal oversight and claimed they found absolutely nothing. Nothing? After all that evidence, after multiple forms of scientific detection confirmed large metallic objects in that exact location, the FBI wants us to believe that all their equipment, all their research, all their historical documentation was just wrong. But the Paradas have photographs. They have videos showing FBI agents loading heavy containers onto trucks in the middle of the night. They have witnesses who saw the operation. And they have records showing that the FBI's own equipment detected the same metallic signatures that led the treasure hunters to the site in the first place. In 2024, the Paradas filed a lawsuit demanding that the FBI release records of what they actually found at Dents Run. The federal government's response? They claim that releasing any information about their excavation would compromise national security. National security? Over a Civil War treasure hunt? That tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the deep state takes this issue. They're not just dismissing these treasure hunters as harmless cranks. They're treating Confederate gold as a legitimate threat to federal authority. And it's not just Pennsylvania. Similar mysterious federal interventions have been reported in Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia. Anywhere treasure hunters get close to significant Confederate caches, federal agents seem to appear with legal injunctions, environmental concerns, or homeland security issues that shut down private excavation efforts. The pattern is unmistakable. The federal government is systematically suppressing Confederate treasure hunting, not because the treasure doesn't exist, but because they're terrified of what its discovery would mean politically and culturally. Here's what I think is really happening. The deep state knows that Confederate gold exists in significant quantities. They've probably been quietly recovering it for decades through various federal agencies. But they can't admit this publicly because it would validate everything that Southern heritage advocates have been saying about the competence and legitimacy of Confederate leadership. Finding massive amounts of Confederate gold would prove that Southern leaders successfully preserved resources for future generations. It would demonstrate that the Confederate government was more organized and effective than official histories claim. And most importantly, it would show that networks of Southern patriots have successfully kept secrets and protected heritage for over 160 years. This is why they're so desperate to control the narrative. Every significant treasure discovery represents a victory for traditional American values over federal historical revisionism. The Christian families who donated their sacred possessions to the Confederate cause believed they were investing in future generations. They believed their sacrifice would someday be vindicated. The federal government's desperate attempts to suppress treasure hunting suggest that those faithful Christians may have been right. So what does all this mean for us today? It means that the battle over Confederate gold is really a battle over American identity. It's about whether we'll accept the federal government's version of history or demand the right to discover truth for ourselves. The treasure hunters fighting legal battles against the FBI aren't just looking for gold. They're fighting for the principle that Americans have the right to explore their own history without government interference. They're standing up for the idea that official narratives can be challenged by independent research and discovery. And the deep state's panicked response tells us everything we need to know. If Confederate treasure was really just a myth, they would ignore treasure hunters entirely. Instead, they're using every tool of federal power to shut down independent research. That's not the behavior of an organization confident in its version of events. The lost Confederate gold represents something that terrifies the establishment, proof that their enemies were more capable, more organized, and more successful than they want to admit. It represents validation for everyone who refuses to accept official narratives about American history. Whether Dennis and Kem Parada ever get justice in their lawsuit against the FBI remains to be seen. But their courage in challenging federal overreach has already accomplished something important. It's exposed the deep state's desperation to control historical narratives. The next time someone tells you that questioning official history makes you a conspiracy theorist, Remember the treasure hunters who had scientific evidence, historical documentation, and eyewitness accounts, and were still dismissed by federal authorities who conducted secret midnight excavations and claimed national security exemptions. The truth about Confederate gold is still out there, buried in forests and fields across America. And as long as patriots are willing to keep digging, both literally and figuratively, that truth will eventually come to light. The federal government can seize treasure sites, classify documents, and intimidate individual treasure hunters. But they can't stop the American people from asking questions and demanding answers. That's the real treasure we're fighting for, not gold, but truth. And that's a treasure worth any sacrifice. Thanks for watching, and remember, the deeper they try to bury the truth, the more valuable it becomes when we finally dig it up.